And there we go. There we are. All right. It is live and up and running. So, time to grab the old linkage and share it out to a couple of different spots. Let's go here. Like now. Paste there. There we go. I don't think I need to really share that anyplace else. Except for, oh, wait, maybe here. Maybe here. There we go. Paste there. Here we go. That way we can make sure that's all done up. A little more quick smoke, and then I'll get into the show. These mountains and streams, the flag ain't the problem, it's the folks with the schemes. True to the land, that's the men on the throne. This country's hard, it's the people not so. It's their dirty hands that keep us in chains. And we'll rise for the land that can't ever profane. So wave like an art card. Deep in this patch of earth, the anthem is playing to the monopoly. I'll shout for the people, not bureaucracy. True to the land, not the men on the throne. This country's hard, it's the people not so. It's their dirty hands that keep us in chains. And we'll rise for the land that can't ever profane. Don't need a suit to show what I'm worth. My roots run deep in this patch of earth. The anthem and plague, the monopoly. I'll shout for the people, not bureaucracy. True to the land, not the men on the throne. This country's hard, it's the people not so. It's their dirty hands that keep us in chains. And we'll rise for the land they can't ever profane. The stripes and the stars, they belong to us all. Not the fat cats parading in grand marble halls. With the sweat and the struggle, the fire and flames. They don't own our patriot hearts or our names. Just a minute. Stay questioning on next law every week. When I see through the lies, they refuse to critique. A landlord's fighting isn't on my throne. It's the hands of the workers. It's what we all own. It's what we all own. Okay. No, that's good. Go ahead and throw it on there. Don't need a suit to show what I'm worth. We'll go ahead and do a little bit of grifting. My roots run deep in this patch of earth. I feel guilty even saying such a thing, but that's it. Just bear in mind, folks, I don't do this for a living. By any means. Okay, that's enough of that. Stuff that. And here we go. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins Truergy, also known various places online as Byron of Sidious. Today on the Storyteller's Corner, I want to talk a little bit about, quite frankly, one of my favorite subjects, mythology and legend, the ties that bind us. And by us, I mean humanity writ large.
Mythology and legendarium, epics, shorts, modest length, regardless of the length of the story, have tied us together as a species since we evolved to the point where we could communicate verbally or through at least some kind of strange grunting noises and gesticulations. Part of what I have found fascinating in the years that I have been diving into various cultural mythologies, thanks in no small part to my collection of mythological tomes from Flame Tree Publishing. Very much appreciate the not only the wealth of material in these tomes, but they're beautifully crafted. They're the printing on these, the construction of these books is quite gorgeous, quite fabulous. Fabulous, I know, but I have quite enjoyed diving into these tomes of mythos over the course of the last couple of years. I do have a few entries in their series that I still have to get, especially from their third wave of collections. Though I'm not impressed with the reduction in quality. Um, Flame Tree Publishing has got a new imprint, 451, which is they're these smaller sort of trade paperback collections, which they're still well put together. And I have appreciated the stories that have been collected for these volumes. It's just they're not quite as aesthetically pleasing to the eye, I guess, or even to the touch. But when you're more interested in the material within and the actual lore that is on offer, then as opposed to the actual covers, then the format, the physical format, isn't quite as important as the quality and variety of the material within. But I can get a little persnickety about that sometimes. I'm willing to admit that. Um, but legends and mythologies are one of the ways in which human cultures throughout history have maintained their connections to one another amongst a vast diaspora of peoples. When one thinks of mythology or legends, there tends to be a small set of, in the West at least, immediately reached for assumptions. When you say mythology, particularly in America, one of the first things people think of is Greek mythology. They think of Hercules and Zeus and Hades, Hera, the pantheon of the gods on Mount Olympus, and their struggles against the titans who came before them, including Kronos, father of many of the gods. That tends to be where their mind goes immediately to. Though I particularly am fond of the tale of Prometheus, the titan who, after the titans were deposed by the gods, and after the gods determined that mankind was not dutifully worshipful enough of them, mighty Zeus, and this is just in accordance to some of the myths and legends. There's so many of them to choose from. The sources are impossible to track down. But one of my favorite tales regarding Prometheus is that the gods, especially Zeus, felt that humanity was not being dutifully worshipful of the gods of Mount Olympus, and so he stole from them, stole away many of their advancements that allowed them to function properly as societies and as a civilization, including one of the most vital of those gifts or advancements, which was the use of fire. Prometheus, one of the few remaining free titans still roaming the earth, discovered that humanity had been robbed of fire and that they were being preyed upon by animals from the wilderness and the various monsters of legendarium in that realm. And he decided, this is not right. The gods are doing to humanity what they did to us, but even worse, because we are titans. We can withstand the challenges of living in this world under the boot of the gods. Humans don't have it anywhere near the same kind of chance. And so Prometheus snuck his way to up to Mount Olympus and crept into the forge of Hephaestus, the blacksmith of the gods, and took from Hephaestus's forge a portion of the fire that he used to heat his anvil. And he took it back to the world below Olympus and returned fire to humanity. Having seen what was done and that humanity was returning to its capacity to thrive, Zeus was quite wroth and sought out the source of this fire, recognizing that it was similar to the fire from Hephaestus's forge, and that humanity had rediscovered the ability and knack to create their own fire as a result of kind of mimicking that flame. He thought to himself, who would do this? And he interrogated many of the lesser gods in his court to try and determine who would have done such a thing. Having determined that none of the gods of Olympus would dare to broach or go against his will in stripping humanity of fire, he determined that only a Titan would have done such a thing. But who among the Titans could roam amongst mankind to bring them back this gift, would look enough like a human being that they could pass in their presence and grant them this boon? His determination was that it could only have been Prometheus, who, while large, looked like mankind. And so Zeus had Prometheus clapped in irons and dragged to the side of a mountain to a great eagle's nest where he was bound and chained to a boulder. And he was granted the gift of eternal life, that at the end of each day, no matter what happened to him, he would rise when the sun was dragged across the sky the next morning. He would arise renewed, but still chained to the mountainside. And each day, a great eagle sent by Zeus would devour his flesh and eat his liver, slowly killing him over and over again. This was to be his eternal punishment for returning the gift of fire to mankind. Part of the reason I love that story is because you have this mythic figure in Prometheus who had once been amongst the ruling creatures or life forms according to the mythos and the pantheon of the gods and the titans, who was never himself a tormentor or destroyer of humanity. He was indifferent to them. And by indifferent, I mean in the classical sense of the word. He was neither hateful nor loving. He was sort of, whatever. He was neutral about humanity. He really did not care enough, one way or the other, to either love or hate humankind. He was indifferent. But having seen what the gods, what Zeus did to humanity, and identifying with the pain of having been cast down by the gods, Prometheus decided, this is not fair. My people, my brethren, my kin can survive, having been stripped of our power and position by the gods, but mankind doesn't stand a chance. And so he delivered unto them a great boon. And for that boon, he was punished eternally. He chose to and he knew full well that eventually he would be found out for the one who did this, who went against Zeus's will. But he accepted that punishment. He did not revolt. He He did not struggle against his captors from Olympus. He accepted his punishment so that mankind could have a fighting chance. He acted as a sort of guardian paternal figure, or a figure of salvation for mankind. This is a wonderful piece of mythology, and I would encourage anybody and everybody, if you have the opportunity, to grab some of the Flame Tree Publishing epic tales, mythology collections, um, because I came across, over the years, I've come across several versions of that story, many of them shorter, but it was in this one that some of the details of Prometheus's sort of rebellion against the gods of Olympus were more thoroughly detailed. And again, these are pieces of fiction. They're not real. This is not historical fact that we're dealing with. But the concepts and precepts carried in that narrative, we see them repeated over and over again in various other stories from other cultures and traditions throughout history. Think, if you will, on a couple of other traditional mythological creatures, characters, scenarios. I would point you to dragons. Dragons which show up in all kinds of mythologies, from Asian mythologies to the Celtic mythologies to even Native American lore. Some stories discuss large flying snakes, which, if you parse that down, sounds eerily similar to the notion of dragons. Fred Saberhagen's Book of Swords indicates or implies that dragons in the world of his series, they start off absolutely tiny, no bigger than a lighter, and they don't go roaring through the skies and dominating mankind or terrifying them with gouts of flame that they breathe down on small villages while they snatch away their sheep and somehow gather and hoard gold. There's some interesting theories that I've seen pop up in notes on Substack about that. I believe it was either Scoot or Hylandia who had said, you know what I think? I think dragons poop gold. Because where else are they getting all this gold and these gems from? It must be that whatever they're eating, their digestive system turns it into gold pieces or gems, or lumps of high value metals. How else do they get all this stuff? It can't just be taken from adventurers who have come on a quest to slay them. How did they start their hoard? Well, maybe it's their waste. Anyway, dragons, while depicted in wildly different fashions amongst various cultures, you look at most Asian depictions of dragons, particularly Chinese dragons, when they're sketched or drawn on scrolls or in their books, they tend to be greatly elongated. They fly through the air without the assistance of necessarily wings, but kind of feathery ridges or scales that are slightly elevated off of their central body form to allow them to manipulate or carve through the air as they take flight, as opposed to the more traditional European style of presentation of dragon, the great big worms with leathery bat-like wings, as opposed to 30-something media. Greetings and salutations. I'm doing all right, sir. Thanks for asking. Hope you're finding yourself well on this fine Friday morning. And then you take a look at Serpentine Dragons Are Bay. Hey, Raisin, how you doing, dear? Serpentine Dragons Are Bay, she says. The more Asiatic serpent-like dragons. As opposed to, like I said, the more European classical sort of dragons you would see in the books of Dungeons and Dragons from TSR Publishing, or nowadays Wizards of the fucking Coast. Um, that's a different type of presentation. And then you look at some of the folklore of Native Americans, wherein, again, from Flame Tree Publishing, wherein they describe dragons as really huge lizards, the size of the size of buffalo, but they don't describe them in at least any of the myths or legends that I have read through in that entry. I haven't finished that collection yet. I will admit to that. So it could be I come across something that is different. But their concept of dragons were great big beasts that were reptilian, like snakes, but they had 4 legs and stomp around, and they eat pretty much everything in sight, but they don't have wings. They don't fly. They don't breathe fire, but they have rows and rows of teeth with which they can chew through any living thing and many inanimate things, including trees and stones. It was Some of their legends describe these dragon creatures as responsible for the felling of trees. They tend to follow after, according to the Native American legends, dragons follow after natural catastrophes and disasters like hurricanes or tornadoes, and that the great winds that blow through are not the actual reason why trees are felled from the earth, but rather these dragons come through sensing or feeding off of the destructive energies of that natural disaster, and they chew up and fell the trees and destroy the stones that are moved from place to place in these high winds. Um, yeah, Raisin's like, if they've got 4 legs, they shouldn't have wings too. Um, I can't draw for shit, but 30 something media, you are an artiste of the visual form. Perhaps, yes, streaming some illustrations and some dragons for us. Chris says, indicating that she would be interested in seeing that. Um, yeah, I would say give 30 something media a follow. And when he's hopped on there to do a drawing, go ahead and hop in and watch him do his particular art form. It's very relaxing stuff. I enjoy it. Another common mythological creature of traditional legend and lore is, and Chris is going to ding on this one, the phoenix. Though often depicted as a giant, roaring, flame cloaked bird, the phoenix in various mythologies starts off as a warbird or a bird of prey, either a falcon or a hawk, that is imbued with a warrior spirit, or the spirit of a warrior that has fallen in battle. When the phoenix rises, it is almost always a sign that there has been some great travesty or tragedy that has taken place in a localized or nearby geographical range to the spirit of that bird. The concept of this flaming bird rising up to try and achieve some form of vengeance or justice on behalf of those who have been wrongfully felled in brutal confrontations. In the European folklore, at least in most European folklore, the phoenix, it inhabits these birds of prey and guides them to battlefields. And once it arrives at that battlefield, the phoenix sheds a single flaming tear to the ground in an attempt to purify the ground of the violence and the hostility that has bled into the earth itself. And in the event that there is too much hostility and violent and negative energy in that small region for it to purify with its tears. It will instead stand in the midst of that battlefield and absorb that energy into itself. At this juncture, the phoenix rises into the air and lights itself aflame to burn away the human misery and hatred that it has taken into itself, the pain and suffering. And it then reverses course and dive bombs into the ground face first in an act of self immolation as a sacrifice to purify the land itself. But the nobility of this sacrifice is what allows the phoenix in the ashes to reform into an egg. And when that egg hatches, it is born anew, a purified phoenix that has completed its task to the realms and is now clean and will grow to become a new phoenix again, to continue its purpose, to attempt to purify the lands. In Celtic mythology, this is specifically different than Germanic or Austrian or Saxon mythos. The phoenix is more a bringer of bringer of warning. When the phoenix in the court of the Seelie or the unseelie court, the phoenix's presence is seen as an omen of great conflict. The bird is depicted as enormous, roughly the size of a rock. Birds of prey that grow through magical means, unexplained magical means in most instances, to be roughly the size of your classic dragon. And when the phoenix senses that conflict is about to kick off, when there's about to be bloodshed amongst the Seelie and the unseelie and the Fae, that is when the phoenix ignites itself in flames as a warning sign that there is about to be battle. This version of the phoenix does not implode, it doesn't self immolate. It streaks through the skies of the realms of the Fae as a banner pennant of warning. It's an omen, letting all within the realms of Fae know there is about to be some bad shit going down. You can then, however, look to West and North African mythology, where the phoenix is depicted as, again, a bird of prey that can ignite itself in and wrap itself in flames. But in those legends, in those tales, the phoenix's purpose is to effectively use itself as a suicide bomb to go after those who willingly and purposely harm the innocent. In tribal mythology out of, I believe it's Congolese mythology. Double check here. Oh shit! Of course, this is one of the volumes that doesn't have an index. I have to go through and rediscover where it's listed. I believe it's Congolese. I could be wrong on this one, but in Central African mythology, the phoenix is a spirit that takes the form of a normal mortal bird, a large bird, a bird of prey, typically a falcon or a hawk, that appears on the outskirts of whatever village or settlement that its target lives within. And it stalks this individual who has willfully harmed an innocent until such time as that person finds themselves isolated and alone and away from other people. Once the target is isolated, the bird swoops overhead and ignites itself in flames, and then dive bombs and kills its prey, its target, in order to render justice, to render vengeance upon those who would prey upon the innocent. This is a very different kind of mythology or legendarium origin story for the same creature. How exactly do we have such disparate presentations or versions of the same effective creature? Its purpose is different, and its presentation is slightly different, but it's always a bird of prey that is oversized and ignites itself in flames. It's a common tie amongst peoples who may not necessarily have even interacted historically closely enough or frequently enough in order to share these stories amongst themselves. It's possible, I would posit, that perhaps one or two explorers or adventurers during eras of migration may have brought their stories to one another's cultures, but due to either linguistic differences or cultural custom differentiations and a difference of priorities, what is common practice or the expectations of one culture versus another would change the purpose and presentation of the similar creature type. Raisin says, "Come, mighty Justice Bird, we need you today." Right? Balance through fire is what I hear. And 30 something media says, thinking about doing a medieval style marginalia stream next time I do drawings. Killer bunnies, knights riding snails, very Monty Python. Um, it's just a rabbit, sir. Boris, go down there and cut its head off. Yes, my liege. Very Monty Python and Holy Grail. I like it. Um, yeah, medieval style marginalia. That'd be pretty neat. Um, the next traditional creature I want to touch upon or kind of gloss over briefly would be gorgons. The most well known gorgon in mythological history, particularly in the West nowadays, would be the Medusa. What is a gorgon? It depends on your lore source. In Greek mythology, classically, gorgons are large female humanoids from the waist up with the lower torso and legs, quote unquote, not really legs, lower body of a large purple and yellow snake. I'm not certain why these creatures are always depicted, or not always, but frequently depicted as having purple and yellow scales. I would posit perhaps it's something to do with a kind of a metaphorical tie to venomous snakes, presenting with those kinds of colorations in their scales in the Greco-Roman region. I'm not certain, but that would be I would think, a hypothesis that at least has some kind of logic to it, given that these creatures, universally, by the way, lamias, almost universally depicted as female from the waist up in their humanoid portion. Um, in Greek mythology, they were depicted that way, with having hair of snakes and having the capacity to turn men to stone with a stare. Hold that note. I have to use the bathroom quickly. Sorry about that, folks. I don't want to leave you with dead air, so let me put on a quick soundtrack, and I'll be right back. Here we go.
That's just fine from sea to shining sea. Say what you please. These lands on fire, you're still so free. Hey, it's so otherwise, it's so free. Take it or leave it, that's the decree. You can run anywhere, do what you see. So hey, it's so otherwise, it's so free. Drive through deserts, fly over plains, no border stops, no heavy chains. Back it up, chase that dream. Turns out it's simpler than it seems. It's so otherwise, it's so free. Take it or leave it, that's the decree. You can run anywhere, do what you see. So hey, it's so otherwise, it's so free. Drive through deserts, fly over plains, no border stops, no heavy chains. Back it up, chase that dream. Turns out it's simpler than it seems. Hey, it's so otherwise, it's so free. Take it or leave it, that's the decree. You can run anywhere, do what you see. So hey, it's so otherwise, it's so free.
All right. Sorry about that. But in Greek mythology, as I was saying, Medusa is the first name that comes to mind when it comes to these creatures, because she was the most notable matriarch of the Gorgons. But these were not creatures that only showed up in Greek mythology. Part of the reason that many of these myths are shared amongst cultures historically is because of, well, let's just call a spade, because of conquest. Um, Epic Raisin says, poor Medusa, she was just trying to be a chaste and faithful follower of Athena. That's some epic victim blaming in myth. This is where we have one of my other fascinations about mythology is there's different versions of these stories. For a more modern example, I would turn to Snow White, because there's Austrian lore, there's the Romansh lore, there's Scottish/Celtic lore, and Irish mythology, each telling the same basic story, but with some changes and details that ultimately reflect a very different story in its conclusion and totality. Medusa was seen as the matriarch, or the mother of many of the gorgons that would plague Greek mythology later on. There are at least two or three different source stories for Medusa's origin. One of the better known ones was that, yes, she was a follower of Athena, that she was attempting to be chaste and faithful. However, she drew the affections and adorations of one of a soldier, a captain, who was married and who lusted after Medusa. And because she tempted this man through no action of her own, she did not pursue him, but this man ended up leaving his goodly wife, who was herself a priestess of Athena. And in order to punish Medusa for the crime against one of her chosen goddesses, she turned Medusa into a monstrosity. Now, that is, as Chris points out or indicates, that is some huge victim blaming. Like, Medusa wasn't trying to lure this soldier in. She wasn't trying to tempt him. He came through her temple or through her village and caught eyes on her and immediately took a fancy to her. When the dude should have known better. His wife was back home at her temple doing her duties as a priestess of Athena. And this is really unfair. When you think about it for more than 5 seconds, you realize, so he was a douchebag and she got blamed for it. However, and this is just my hypothesis, I believe that the lesson that the storytellers of that era, I think what they were trying to convey, or the message they were trying to get across, the lesson they were trying to impart upon listeners or readers of that story, was to tell women in Greece, if you are beautiful, be modest. Dress modestly. Do not present yourself in public in such a way that you will tempt the men around you. I think that was what they were aiming for because that was the cultural practice and societal expectation of the folks who were telling that story. Now, Chris, one of the other versions of the Medusa origin story carries along a similar path or pattern, but rather than the soldier captain being turned into a monster, he didn't, but instead, Athena spoke to her father, Zeus, and demanded retribution against this captain. And so Zeus, working hand in hand with his brother Poseidon, arranged for that captain to go back home on a ship that would be torn apart by a kraken at sea. He got his, just in a very different way. You gotta remember, the Greek gods were dicks. They were not pleasant, even in their own mythology. Um, yeah. No, you gotta remember, Chris, the societal cultural expectations and norms were much different. But there are also, in Celtic lore, there were gorgons, but they were referred to as cockatrices. Women who were these creatures that were sort of a blend or admixture of human and fowl, like birds. They were festooned with fluffy white feathers, and rather than having a nose, they had this angular beak. And with the Celtic cockatrice, turning people into stone was not something they willfully did. Part of the reason why a cockatrice's eyes constantly dart around in the stories of Celtic mythology is because if they stare too long at a living being, they will turn it into stone. It was not a willful ability of the cockatrices, but rather a curse of those creatures. They were imbued with this curse because originally in the mythology, the cockatrices were brilliant strategists working on behalf of the Seelie court, recruiting, training, and commissioning soldiers and warriors and guardians to protect the peoples of the Fey realm as soldiers of the Seelie court. However, a handful of these creatures decided to betray King Oven during his reign as the Fey king, overseeing the Seelie court. And to punish them, he cursed the entirety of the cockatrice people with this this ability that if they stared at anything long enough, they would turn it to stone, which would cause no one to want to be around them, an attempt to ostracize them. But he couldn't just kill them outright. He would have been seen as a tyrant and be deposed by the other Fae. So rather than just slaughter them or have them exiled forcefully, he cursed them with a defensive power, as you would, or as it were, something that they could use on their enemies. But the cockatrices, they trained soldiers, yes, but they did not train them to kill. They exercised restraint to try and best your enemy without destroying them. So being cursed with this ability to turn other living things to stone, to effectively kill them just with looking at them too long, as a social race amongst the Seelie people, This was anathema to their very essence and being. This was one of the cruelest curses that could be leveled against a member of the Fey peoples. In other words, total dick move. One of the worst things that King Owen ever did, according to, again, Sealy Court mythology historically. But again, there's some back and forth about W.B. Yeats, professor of mythology in particular. He does not even acknowledge the reign of King Owen in the Sealy Court historically, because there's only a handful of stories that were ever written down permanently regarding King Owen and his reign. So again, there's a lot of wiggle room there. But then, moving on to a different type of mythology and legendarium, let us touch upon ghosts. Ghosts and ghasts and poltergeists and revenants. Oh my! No matter what part of the world you grow up in, where you're raised, what your natural language is, no matter what faith you are raised in or ascribe to, the chances are approaching certainty that somewhere in your history, the history of your people, be it ethnically or culturally or religiously, there are stories about human spirits that do not quite pass on to the next life. This is universal. Every culture historically has had some story about the essences of humanity that don't go to their destined or predestined afterlife. They're caught between the living and the dead. I personally find this weirdly and darkly encouraging because it is a tie that binds us all together. Why do we have this universal acceptance of the notion that ghosts are a thing? Now, yes, there are certain borderline fundamentalist religious groups and orders that would say there's no such thing as ghosts. Those are just demons. Okay, so you want to get dicey about the language used, the terminology. Okay, I'll grant you that. But wouldn't that just go into demons, which are also a nearly universal concept amongst different cultures and societies and faiths? Demons and ghosts and poltergeists, all of these supernatural things share a commonality. All peoples throughout history have had some kind of legends or mythologies, some sort of stories passed around the campfire or passed around in books, in collections, in television, in films, in video games. We have ghosts. The source lore is almost always the same as well. The essence or spirit or soul of a human being that passed away but was not able to move on entirely and thus are caught, stuck and trapped and attached to the living world tangentially, but with which they cannot really overtly interact. Now, this is the differentiation between a ghost and a poltergeist, however. Ghosts cannot interact with the tangible, physical, mortal, living world. Poltergeists very much can, and they do so quite destructively. Their rage manifests into psychokinetic events and incidences. It's where you get things like stray bolts of ball lightning, according to some mythologies and stories. It's where you end up with the lights flickering. It's where you see the drapes blow, and twitch and twitch. Ask the folks in Lilydale; they'll tell you. Bunch of fraudsters that they are. But anyway, I digress. Gonna take a brief moment here. I've been rambling on for almost 50 minutes, and I've only mentioned it the once the idea or notion of grifting. If you are watching on YouTube, guess what? I'm not a big enough channel to be monetized. Never have been, really. So AdSense, channel memberships, that's not a thing. However, if you are enjoying or appreciate this sort of bookish, nerdy chat and are able and willing to offer up any kind of financial support in the form of a donation, there's the PayPal address. Quote the Raven666 at yahoo.com. No one should ever feel obligated because I don't do this to try and earn a living. But would I appreciate it? Yeah. Yeah, I really would. I'm just a mythologist and a storyteller. But any tangible assistance or support is always appreciated. But again, not necessary, and I'm not going to push that too hard. Thank you very much for that brief little aside. Moving along past ghosts, unless anybody here in watching right now wants to bring up a question or a comment or their own note or bit of lore to go into ghosts and poltergeists and ghasts and revenants and that sort of thing. Cripes, you know what I really should have written down to discuss would be cryptids. But that's a whole other thing. There's so many different cryptids to try and analyze and go through and be like, yeah, talk about dogmen and Bigfoot and the Mothman, shit like that. I've always found fascinating as a storyteller, as someone who loves mythology. There's a couple of those creatures that I mentioned that even show up in this bad boy, this Urban Legends collection. Got this about a year and a half ago, Half Price Books. Which, by the way, when I was at Half Price Books the other day, I finally found a copy of a science fiction novel that I have had recommended to me by pretty much everybody in my personal circles of acquaintances or friends or colleagues who is into sci-fi. They've all mentioned this book at least once or twice, and several of them have hounded me about trying to get a copy so I could read it. I'm finally going to take the chance at some point in the next couple months to read Larry Niven's Ringworld. As a fan of sci-fi, apparently I have not done my due diligence and my duty to the art of narrative as a reader to partake of this novel, and I'm finally going to get around to that hopefully soon. You may browbeat me if you need to or if you wish. Anyway, moving along. Something that I don't think a lot of folks would consider mythology or legend because it is primarily rooted in the more modern age or modern era, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, are stories regarding the following three types of life forms, if you can consider them alive: robots, cyborgs, and androids. I'll explain what I mean when I get back. I have to hit the bathroom again. But I'm not going to leave you in silence. I'm not going to leave you in what the folks at the Kino Casino would say is dead air! Because nobody likes dead air. Here we go. Cue this thing. Back in a moment.
Flips on my board with a popsicle stick. Neon shoes light me up like a space age trick. Flipping channels, turtles screaming cowabunga, dude. Saturday mornings were a whole damn mood. Razor fists for the 80s and 90s times. Scrambled TV and serial crimes. Thundercats on as the world flies by. Americana's glow under a technicolor sky. Blaring mix mixing with the Walkman buzz. Comic books complex yet ridiculous because it's a world where kids save the mall's arcade, and everyone is glow under a technicolor sky. There's a fist for the 80s and 90s times, scrambled TV and serial crimes. Thundercats on as the world flies by, America is glow under a technicolor sky. Wearing mixing with the Walkman buzz. Comic books complex yet ridiculous because it's a world where kids save the mall's arcade, and every lunchtime at a pizza parade. Raise your fist for the 80s and 90s times, scrambled TV and serial crimes. Thundercats on as the world flies by, America is glow under a technicolor sky. DeLoreans roar, lightning tore the clock. Rewind a battle, Skeletor around the block. Snap bracelets, snapping dreams untamed, and every stranger knew Mario's name. Captain's pop ball, the Slinkies race, bubblegum war painting on our faces. VHS tape, rewound with the grind. Yeah, those were the days when it all aligned.
Okay, sorry about that. Robots, cyborgs, and androids are not terms that most people would associate with the word mythology or legend. I would posit, however, that in the current day and age, with our sort of pseudo obsession with AI, I would posit that particularly robots of the more classical variety or design that you would see in programs like the opening few seasons of Doctor Who on the BBC, like the Cybermen, because they have not always exactly looked slick or impressive. The early days of Star Trek, the original series, in the written stories of Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics. I'm sure plenty of you know them. The first rule is that a robot may not harm a human being under any circumstances. The second rule of law of robotics is that a robot must not allow itself to come to harm, excepting in such case as its own self-preservation would bring a human to harm. I'm actually blanking on the third law of robotics. I have plenty of Asimov. I haven't read it all yet, and unfortunately, I'm going to need a refresher here pretty soon. But again, the term mythology typically makes people think of historical references of fiction and fairy tales. But in the modern era, robots and cyborgs and androids are not things that have yet come into being in our day-to-day lives. Now, yes, we do have robots in industrial production. We have fully automated machines that perform tasks that they are programmed and assigned to complete. But a robot with any kind of independent thought, that's not a thing yet. Cyborgs, again, the technology is advancing to the point where we might get there eventually, where cyborgs will be a thing. Its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second. Oh, so I was quoting the second law. Or, oh, wait, no, okay, so they must not harm a human. They must protect themselves. Huh. Shit. Thank you, though, Chris, for bringing that up. Thank you. But when we think of cyborgs in classical sci-fi terms, we are thinking of, most times at least, human beings who have grafted pieces of technology into or onto themselves. One of the most common examples I think of stems from Ghost in the Shell, the anime Ghost in the Shell, where a cyborg is a human being that has had components of their body replaced with technological components that are either covered up to appear mostly human or humanoid in presentation. You look at comic books. Comic books are a big source of the presentation of cybernetics. You look at, hell, the video game and tabletop role playing system Cyberpunk or Shadowrun, where the augmentation of human beings with technological components to advance their skills, abilities, and capacities to live in a future realm or reality that requires them to be on the cutting edge of technological advancement and capacity. Imbuing yourself with cybernetics is almost a necessity just to get by. Oh, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Yes. See, I'm not a big enough person to have like a producer. So having somebody in the chat willing to help me out with something like that when I stumble into an area where I'm not an expert, but I really love the material and the available books and movies and shows in that arena, it's very helpful. I appreciate it. Again, I'm kind of an amateur level mythologist, especially when it comes to modern mythology of the sort that we're currently talking about with robots, cyborgs, androids. Um, but what makes these presentations almost universal is that our continued understanding as time goes by, as we actually develop technologies that are coming closer and closer to mimicking what we have imagined in the past would look like the current day technology. Let's not forget that Asimov talked about and wrote stories about telephone booths that would have video screens that you would talk into so you could see the other person on the person on the other end of the line. Hello. We have FaceTime. Now, true, we don't go into a separate booth that's parked on the street like an old telephone booth to have these conversations or make these communications. We can now carry them around in our pockets, but the same effective presentation and function was imagined by Isaac Asimov so many decades ago. He had an idea, a concept that we've come close to mirroring. And there's a certain amount of dread, at least for me, when it comes to how closely he came to getting it spot on. But that's because he was himself a scientist and a technologist. He was himself an engineer. He was educated in the concepts of scientific principles that he was able to kind of glean an idea of what these things might look like in future presentation. Those of us who have a familiarity with the advancements of programs and machinery are going to be the ones who are best able to predict what these cybernetic enhancements are going to look like in the future. Our storytellers who are obsessed with futurism, they become obsessed, yes, but they end up doing a lot of reading and research into these things. And even if they are not themselves engineers or scientific pioneers of them by themselves, they're able to glean a basic understanding of what these technologies and augmentations may very well end up looking like in the future. I would posit this is why some of the best drawn depictions of futuristic technology come from people who dive deep into the precepts of that field of study. Robotics, engineering, advanced mathematics, they're able to do at least a surface level rendition of what it might look like. And the folks who are artistically inclined visually to the point where they can actually draw those things, they are geniuses, and I love every one of them in their own way. But no homo. Anyway, sorry. I didn't think about that, Chris. It's been a long time since I read Foundation. Shit, years and years. But across cultures, the presentation style of androids and cyborgs shares a certain similarity, whether it be in Japanese anime or in Western illustrations and comic books. You have similarities across cultures because there's a shared scientific understanding. I can at least point to that as a common tie, why these different cultures would render a similar visual result or detailed explanation of what the final product is going to look like. Nowadays, we are able to communicate ideas and concepts so quickly and so broadly that there almost forms a universality that is logical. We have shrunk the world by advancing how quickly we can communicate and travel within it. There are some areas of life where this seems to have the unfortunate effect of universalizing things and making them dull, uniform, drab, and almost lifeless. This is a sidebar, but I think of some of the travel stories that I have read over the years, wherein people, and I'm talking real travel stories of the real world. Um, Nowhere is it more obvious than here in the United States, which geographically is a gigantic country. But if I were to go to a major metropolitan hub in downtown Minneapolis, about 20 minutes north of where I live, and I look around at the environment, I am likely not going to be able to tell the difference between that part of the city based on the various stores and merchants and the architectural stylings in the modern era. I'm not going to be able to tell much of the difference between downtown Minneapolis and, say, downtown Omaha or even downtown New York City in Manhattan. There's a sameness, there's a blanket uniformity. I actually talk about it a little bit in that comic book series that I read not that long ago, Oblivion Song. I've got it right here. And I'll bring it up as a reference. Um, this scene with the McDonald's and the Starbucks and the new world Bank of Oblivion. Yes, Starbucks is in here. Other Side Mining Corporation. Very samey. There's a sort of a corporate kind of blueprint. People have brought this up or mentioned this, made note of this on Twitter/X in the form of pictures comparing McDonald's and Pizza Hut locations from the 1970s and 1980s as opposed to what those outlets look like now. Nowadays, they're all very square and gray and blocky and lifeless. They're devoid of any kind of essence of spirit that would make them uniquely identifiable from one another outside of a logo and the items offered on the menu. There's a drab kind of sameness. It's not encouraging to think that that kind of universality could explain why there's such a similarity in the depictions of high-end cybernetic technology in anime and manga from the East as opposed to American illustrations and animation in the West. And perhaps that's why we look to things like ancient mythology and lore and legendarium for a sense of the fantastical and the magical, because there was differentiation. Yes, as I was talking about before, the versions and depictions of the phoenix in Celtic lore of the Seelie or the Fae, as opposed to the Central or South African version of the great flaming bird. The exact size and presentation and motivations of the creature are different, vastly different. But there is a shared terminology and a shared expectation. But they're different enough that they are unique to their own specific culture. They share some elements to make them understandable to other peoples, but they're differentiated enough to allow for the beauty of variety. And I think we lose a lot of that when we look into modern mythos in the realm of robotics and cybernetics and androids. But I digress. That was really what I had on the slate for today. And I've gone on for a little over an hour about it. So I feel like I've accomplished my aim in terms of talking myth. I'm going to open it up now to you good folks, you fine folks watching the program. Any comments, questions, or concerns for me as we dovetail towards the end of the show? And I'll throw on some music so we don't have dead air while I wait to see if there's any questions. Ideal song.
The crime ups, the crash downs, the ups and the clowns. We don't match, we're a mess, but my heart still believes. It's wild harmonies, the chaos we need.
Mega Man.
Who shreds with their rainbow hair.
I am not sponsored by G Fuel. I'm not sponsored by anybody. Who would sponsor this? Maybe you? Sorry. Had to do it.
The climb ups, the crash downs, the ups and the clowns. We don't match, we're a mess, but my heart still believes. It's wild harmonies, the chaos we need. The skater who shreds with their rainbow hair. The farmer who dances without a care. The loners, the lovers, the brash and the shy. Together we rise, no need to ask why. It takes all kinds to build this.
Briefly, I'm turning that off for a moment. If you have any questions, keep putting them together and type them in when you're ready. A brief programming announcement. I am planning on doing a stream next Thursday morning, sometime between. I'll be trying to start that show sometime between 10 and 11 a.m. Central Mountain Time here in Minnesota. And it's going to be the first show, the first stream that I'll be hosting with a guest through Rumble Studio. I have a little bit of technical know how to pick up and figure out before that show comes to be. And I already started getting it figured out a little bit. Thankfully, Rumble Studio, as I have praised it before, seems to be pretty user friendly, fairly simple, which is necessary for a guy who is a technical neophyte like myself. I am not very tech savvy, but thankfully, the folks at Rumble seem to have made this a fairly streamlined process, and I will be able to, hopefully, without too much technical kerfuffle, get this guest on screen with me. Very much looking forward to doing that. So yeah, that'll be a first for me. It's also the first time that I am kind of planning ahead to do a show, to do a stream. But in terms of another or secondary programming note, I am nearly finished with the first draft of my next novel project. And it's probably going to take me about another month to go through and clean it up and do the edits necessary for me to feel comfortable to say, okay, it's almost ready to be shared out there to the world. In the past, I have on Substack produced several stories in chapter by chapter format prior to eventually removing the posts down to like between 3 and 5 chapters as free reading availability, and then publishing those works in traditional self-published physical format, as I did with Not So Epic, with The Justice of Amelia. The short stories that are in here originally were free reading material on my Substack. I left them all free to read there for close to 6 months before I started removing them as I assembled this and prepared this book for publication and distribution. The Justice of Amelia, available now. Anyway, how does Atreus puts it? Grift, 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 grift. Anyway, sorry. However, this project that I am currently getting near the end of drafting, I'm not going to be putting up initially on my Substack. My plan right now, and this is tentative, it may change in the future, but I really do want to aim for this. My tentative plan for now, once I've got it through its final draft and it's as tight as I can personally make it, I'm going to be presenting that next novel project as read aloud stream presentations here in the Storyteller's Corner. They'll be archived on the channel because they will have been streamed, and that will probably be the primary format in which I will be presenting that story. And then I will, either the day after I share a read aloud chapter on the stream, I will post it on the Substack so that it is in a tangible, readable, non-audible format so that folks can read it at their own leisure or pace. So there will be parallel presentation of that story chapter by chapter. First, as a read aloud presentation here on the Rumble stream, and then the following day in the form of a Substack post. And I'm probably going to do at least one chapter presentation stream per week until such time as the entirety of the story has been presented. That story, I don't know right now if I plan to publish it in the form of a actual tangible physical book. I'm not sure right now, but the game plan at this juncture is for this story to be entirely presented for your entertainment purposes as a free audio presentation live on stream. And yeah, that's the plan for that right now. But if nothing else, yeah, that should do it for me for today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for spending your time here with me this morning. You have a plethora of options available to you to sit down and enjoy when you decide to come on Rumble or YouTube to sit through and listen to or watch a stream. I'm aware that there are a ton of options and that this is a very niche kind of thing and not everybody's cup of tea. But some of you chose to come here, and I appreciate that you made that choice. It does not escape me that there's plenty of other stuff that draws more eyeballs, gets more attention, and deservedly so. I'm not going to sit here and try and bang on and puff myself up as the greatest things in sliced bread to come to Rumble or YouTube. I'm far from it. But at least I'm aware of that, which can't be said of everybody who hops on here. But I appreciate that you spent some time here with me this morning. I do hope that you find or found that it was worth your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for stopping by. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves. And as always, keep reading.